Today we're going to go back in time. We're going to discuss something historical that I wanted to talk about for some time. And we're going to talk about ethnic identity. So, how a group of people in the past became a group of people with a particular nationality, with their own shared values, and their own identity. Now, when we discuss about identity conflicts in history, this is a particular theme that can make us shiver because history is made of countless conflicts who have shaped identities of multiple people. But when we talk about identity specifically, we refer to ethnic identity, which is a person's sense of belonging to a particular ethnic group. And this identity is often defined by shared characteristics such as culture, language, ancestry, history, and religion, and also traditions. This ethnic identity involves an individual's self-identification with a particular group, and of course their recognition by others as belonging to that group. Moreover, when we think about ethnic identity, can be fluid and also can change over time depending on different factors such as migration, intermarriage, social integration, and personal experiences. And of course, this is also influenced by a broader range of social and political environment, including how an ethnic group is viewed and treated by a dominant culture or society. Now, this identity does not only cover history, but also prehistory when we think, because in every continent, such as Africa, for example, or America, as with the Native American populations, and the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, so anthropologists have identified that every primitive group of people living in a tribal state has a tendency to self-identify themselves simply as the men, and of course in their own languages. So this appears to be more pronounced with Native American tribes. For example, the state of Illinois was named after the Algonquin tribe of the Illiniwek, that simply means the man. And the same goes for other tribes, like the Delaware people, also known as the Lenape, have their own name for themselves. So Lenape means the people, so the literal meaning of it. So at the time, the newly arrived colons from Europe, they didn't know how to call or to pronounce the names of local things in the native language. And so these explorers have created terms because they didn't understand anything in their languages, and they tried to name things in their own languages. And all of these names I've mentioned regularly mean the people. So we are the people, and the others are different from us. If we continue on this trajectory, we found that the Eskimo, also considered Northern Native Americans, with the word itself, Inuit, in the Inuktitut language means the people. As a last example, the term that is well known across a large group of people in Central and South Africa is the word Bantu, that means people. So these are all similar characteristics where these tribes self-identify themselves as the people, as they are unique in a certain way. And these examples may reveal an aspect of human nature, even in the most primal or troubled states, because before encountering others, people often view themselves as true people. And upon meeting others, they did not always recognize the shared humanity of those that they encountered. Now, this point gives us brings us to prehistoric peoples, and because they did not have writing, without writing, and the identity conflicts between different ethnic groups and populations. In the history of Western civilization, we quickly see that people often began to define themselves in opposition to others, not by denying their existence, but by accepting them as inferior beings. One of the most evident cases can be found in the roots of history with the Greeks. So while the Greeks defined themselves in opposition to the barbarians, they built their identity in this contrast with a tremendous effort and an emotional investment. Notably, for example, the Greeks, despite their internal hatred with conflicts and massacres, they would just kill each other in the peninsula all the time. They remained convinced that they were a step above all other humans, and anyone who spoke Greek was by definition considered superior to everyone else. And of course, every 4 years, all the hostilities were suspended, and for the Olympic Games, everybody would just come together, in which only Greek citizens could participate in, and everyone else who did not speak Greek was not considered not entirely inhuman, but rather incapable of speaking properly. So they were thought to merely stutter bar, 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 bar. That's why comes the origin of the term of the word barbarian. Now consider how the Persian Wars have been mythologized, and specifically as the resistance of a people facing a multi-ethnic empire, because we had the conflict of the Greeks against the Persians. The Persian Empire was composed of many different ethnicities, viewed its expansions and assimilation of other people as entirely natural. The Persians already controlled many Greek cities, including those in Anatolia and Ionia, which were Persian territories, even though the Greek people still lived there and served the great king. Meanwhile, the Greeks that maintained in the mainland that resisted and built a powerful mythology around this resistance, a mythology that to this day has persisted. And many of us, you probably have heard about the stand of the 300 Greeks at the Thermopylae. And some of you might even have seen the movie, the film 300. This is Sparta! This was my best scene from that movie. Now, opposite to the Greeks stood this extraordinary Persian Empire, which perfectly embodied a different way of constructing identities. An empire that was built by peoples, and the two people actually, the Persians and the Medes. Medes is spelled Medes. So in fact, the Greeks often refer to them as the Medes rather than the Persians. And above all, this was an empire founded on obedience to an emperor and as a unifying principle. So it was the principle of civilization based on the allegiance to a common authority, which brought together many and diverse peoples. So the titles and names which the Persian emperor defined himself are quite interesting. But let's pause one moment, and Persia is, of course, modern day. It's a modern day Iran, and it's worth noting that the Persians, who might seem so foreign to us, are especially Indo-European, just like us. And the Persian language belongs to the Indo-European language families, which includes many languages spoken across Europe and Asia, such as English, Spanish, Russian, Persian, Hindi, and many others. Now, historically, the term Aryan, exactly like Aryan, like the Nazis used to use the term Aryan as the supreme race. But in this case, the word Aryan is referred to the ancient Indo-Iranian peoples who spoke early forms of the languages that would become Sanskrit and Persian, and their descendants. In the context of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, Aryan was used to describe the noble and honorable peoples of the ancient India and Persia. That means Iran. For example, in ancient texts like the Rig Veda in India and the Avestan, Persia, the term is associated with nobility and identity. Well, the Persian emperors, or the great kings of Persia, proclaimed themselves as lords over the whole world. So both Iranian and non-Iranian. So this is an extraordinary formula because this acknowledges that there is a nationality. Yeah, because you're either from Iran, or not non-Iran. So everybody else was non-Iran. And this nationality was the dominant one, but also includes everything that is not Iranian. It might be considered like the non-Iranian may be considered a little bit inferior, but it still is part of their empire, as they mentioned. Given the examples of the Greeks and the Persians, we can see that as a first point that ethnic identities are always, to some extent, constructed and can be manipulated. This does not mean that they do not exist. Let's be clear about that. So we will see in several examples that an ethnic identity can be invented from scratch, but once it exists, it has an enormous attractive power. Now, identities do not exist as natural, as a given fact, and identity depends on how much human communities, political power, and intellectuals wants to invest in them. So they can be born, they can transform, and I repeat, they can also be manipulated by politics. A second key of interpretation in our past is that there is a polarity that we could associate with the Greeks and the Persians. On one hand, there is the pursuit of exclusive national identities that exclude others. For instance, we're us, we're like this, we're different from others, and generally we're better. And this is always the underlying implication. At the opposite extreme, there are other efforts to create supranational, multi-ethnic, and imperial identities where different ethnicities can coexist without losing certain characteristics. So, while still we're feeling like we belong to a larger identity. And an example of this is the Roman world. Oh yeah, the Romans. With this distinction between Romans and barbarians, which might seem like a re-edition of that between Greeks and barbarians. However, there are quite subtle differences. Now, let's start by saying that naturally, if one uses the term barbarians in its original sense, as coined by the Greeks, then a barbarian is someone without a Greek name. You can see that the Romans are barbarians. In fact, the Romans are barbarians in the eyes of the Greeks at first. However, there are barbarians who defeat the Greeks, and the Greeks triumphed and built their identity on having kept these barbarians away. But the barbarians from the West, from Italy, eventually win and subjugate Greece. Now the Romans, having conquered Greece, encounter a civilization that is so superior that they decide to adopt it, in essence, make a pact with the Greeks. Now, we simplify here a bit, but roughly speaking, the impression is that this is exactly what happened. The Greeks had a privileged status in the Roman Empire as partners, not as subjugated natives, unlike in any other conquered territories. They had a partnership, and in return, the Greeks tacitly accepted the idea that identities are invented, created, and manipulated. Now, the Greeks tacitly accepted changing the meaning of the word barbarians, and at a certain point, it no longer meant someone who is not Greek, but rather someone who is neither Greek nor Roman. This, of course, makes a significant difference. But what does it mean to be Roman? Being Roman is not an ethnic or national identity. Being Roman is primarily a political adherence. To put it better, anyone can be Roman. Rome, at a certain point, begins to build its ideology to justify a project of world conquest, with the idea that being Roman is not like being Greek, where you must speak Greek and be born there. Being Roman can be achieved by anyone who wants it, as long as they accept their identity and its rules. One day, the Emperor Claudius goes to the Senate with a proposed law. Now, we are in the mid of the 1st century AD. And Claudius presents this proposal, which is to admit a number of Gauls into the Senate. Now, Gaul has been a Roman province for a century and is pacified. And Claudius wants to include some Romanized notables from Gaul in the Senate. Now, this proposed law encounters opposition, and some senators stand up and say, quote, "Where are we headed if we admit Gauls who still have Roman blood on their hands, who did everything possible during Caesar's time to avoid being subjugated? What happens to Roman blood, Roman lineage, and senatorial nobility?" End quote. Now, Claudius responds with a great speech recorded by Tacitus, which fortunately has also been found by archaeologists on a large bronze plaque confirming Tacitus' transcription point by point. And it is a rare case to have two sources that confirm each other. Now, what does Claudius say in the Senate? He says, quote, "Among you here who talk to me about Roman lineage and blood, how many of your ancestors were already Romans at the time of Romulus? Let's leave aside how Romulus assembled his people, but look at the senators. You were not Etruscans? How long did the Etruscans resist against Rome? You were Sabines. You were from Alba Longa. You were Samnites, people who fiercely resisted Rome and were eventually defeated. The greatness of Rome is that now you, their descendants, are Romans." End quote. Claudius also makes an even more interesting point for us, for historians, because he says, "We do not act like Greeks. For the Greeks, the foreigner is also a foreigner. In Athens, someone who is not a citizen by birth, even if they come to live there, remains without rights. A metic is meaning, spelling me-e-t-i-c. Someone who lives there but does not have citizenship. And look how it all turned out. Who commands now in Athens? Claudius say, us. We use the opposite people where anyone can be Roman." And this is a really interesting point, and we stop here for this section here, because we see how groups initially formed, and the Greeks make this distinction that you're either a Greek or you are a barbarian, and no matter how long you live with us, you will never have our rights, and you will never be one of us. But came the Romans, and they chose another course of action. They say, well, as long as you can respect our rules and integrate, you can be part of our empire. You can grow with us, and for centuries later, you will have barbarians that basically would be legionaries, that they would be in the army and gain full status and full citizenship as Romans. And that's really something that is really important, because isn't this something that brought the greatness of Rome? Because instead of defeating their opponents and kicking everybody out, for example, they incorporated all those territories with their people inside. And many other nations did that after Rome, I'm pretty sure. But this approach was one that, to a certain extent, guaranteed the success and the growth of the Roman Empire. Well, thank you very much for listening to this first part, and I will see you next time, and be tuned for part 2. Bye.